Welcome to the Drift and Ramble podcast. I'm Steve Blizin. Each episode will explore true stories and American legends. From the pages of history and a few stories handed down over the years, we'll look at the people, places, and events that helped shape a nation. Stories of survival, notable frontier men and women, explorers who struck it rich, and the outlaws that stole it from them. There'll be studies of saloon girls, swindlers, banditry, and bad men, profiles of lawmen and American Indians, and the good and evil that existed between them. We'll amble through the past, we'll delve into the folklore of the times, and maybe even uncover a ghost story or two. So, saddle up, or settle in, for the Drift and Ramble podcast. Well, happy Thanksgiving. Today we come to you with a very special episode prepared by some friends of ours. Three very talented ladies have been involved in the production of this episode that you're about to hear. Leslie McMurtry has written and produced this. Sarah Golding, who you've heard on our show before, has done a number of different character voices for us. She is narrating this. And the music is by Catherine Seaton, who is an extremely talented composer. And I'm very proud to be able to present this on Drift and Ramble. This story was written by Leslie McMurtry, and it is called Alphabet. And it involves a period of history a little bit before the Old West, but something that I thought would still fit with the general historical reference for Drift and Ramble, and I hope you'll enjoy it.
Alphabet by Leslie McMurtry. Narrated by Sarah Golding. I remember the night of December 22nd for many reasons. I had turned 30 that summer, when I had become betrothed to Nathaniel Shy. We had looked forward to this event with great anticipation and anxiety, for I had discovered the week of my arrival at Bucks Cove Run that I was already with child. I had lost my boy and girl, fathered by my first husband in infancy. Knowing this, Nathaniel and I were both taking pains that nothing ill should befall this child, if we could prevent it. Widows did not have to remarry, as my dear Frances told me pointedly. Frances was my first husband's sister, and as dear to me as any sister of my own could have been. Like her brother, Mrs. Bell, the former Frances Mead, kept a shop. His had been in Burlington, while hers was in Philadelphia, like my own parents' tavern. I had never cared much for the Spread Eagle, my parents' tavern, perhaps too deeply ingrained with the counsel of my severe Presbyterian grandmother, with whom my parents sent me to live when I turned 12, as part of my education. Nathaniel's shy now. He was not severe. He had not been talkative or even friendly exactly when I first became acquainted with him in April 1774, nor was he in truth a handsome man. He was 10 years my senior, somewhat weathered-looking in the face, with a sallow complexion and deep lines around his mouth, which seemed as though they could scarcely ever be moved to laugh or smile. When he did smile, much later in our acquaintance, I was startled both by the suddenness and radiance of his smile, but also because he had surprisingly fine teeth, I remember I had been summoned to the door of my house. It had been my first husband Lovell's house before he died, and I maintained it, by a Delaware woman selling brooms, baskets and ginseng. I had from her a broom, and as I was just returning indoors, I saw a man riding up to my neighbours. My neighbours and I attended the same church, so we knew each other well. So, who was this unfamiliar man in the saddle of a huge bay horse, travel-stained, a brown hat pulled low and mysteriously over his face? His hair long and curly, tied in a queue which fell down the back of his dark blue wool coat. He wore riding boots, which he stamped as he approached the threshold to remove the caked mud. Seeing me, he removed his hat and acknowledged me with a curt nod. Curt though it was, I beheld his face long enough to see a scar upon his cheek. He was no picture of beauty, standing there, unsmiling. The next week at church, I asked my neighbours about their visitor. "Oh, that is only Uncle Nathaniel," said Minnie. Minnie's 15, a coquette whose dashing ways were giving me great hardship. She was one of my students at the Burlington Charity School where I was a teacher. She was a day student, so her tuition was paid for by her mother's taking in the sewing for the school. Perhaps this, upon reflection, was what made Minnie eager to take up coquetry. For to distance herself from her mother's unexalted but honest work. "He is visiting on his way back to the Pines. He's been at it." She looked at her mother for permission to go on. "He's been at the meeting in Monmouth County," finished her father. His gaze was sweeping that of the other parishioners in exodus in the churchyard, and what he saw made him less eager to go on. Fortunately, I could infer the rest. Nathaniel Shy, whoever he was, had been attending the meeting protesting governmental tyranny in support of the association in Massachusetts and its hardships. "He brings no wife with him," I observed. "Oh, he's a bachelor," my neighbour confirmed. He and his wife were looking at me quizzically. As a wife, I had been quick to grow stout. Lovell, my husband, had not been a cruel man, nor untrue, but he had failed at business and had turned to solitude. I should have been grateful that he had not turned to drink. The years of our marriage had been a period of mental quietude in which I seemed to recede from myself. I went through the motions of managing our printer's works and then our shop before both failed. I had brief joy during the 2 short lives of our children, carried away by smallpox and throat distemper before the ages of 4 and 5. We had provided companionship of a sort for each other, but we spoke little. We each kept to one narrow side of the bed, and the 9 years seemed a fog. My time teaching was, by contrast, fulfilling. Not everyone approved of our betrothal. As I said, Frances, my sister-in-law, questioned the necessity of it. "You're doing very well with your school," she wrote from Philadelphia. "A man needs a wife to keep house for him, but what do you need a husband for?" She had 3 sons and 2 daughters, all of them strong and healthy. "But I like Mr. Shy," I wrote to her. "Indeed, I find I cannot do without him." We courted by letter during the next months. He returned to Burlington in May and then in July, when the formation of the Committee of Correspondence brought him north. Though I had liked Nathaniel the first moment I saw him, the night we first ate together in each other's company and all subsequent meetings until the night of our wedding, they made it very clear what kind of person he was, which was unvarnished, like the unlovely pine that grew scraggled and with white trunk because it had been struck by lightning. "There will be no circulating libraries in Bucks Cove Run," he had warned me honestly after I had agreed to marry him. He knew I had been born in a city, yet he also knew how I had grown up in my grandmother's farm in Pennsylvania. "You will have to do without many comforts. I was born in a one-room house in Ohio. My parents came over as redemptionists to Virginia." He was educated and a serious, thoughtful, civic-minded man. But there had been no question of my not returning to the Pine Barrens with him when we were married. He could not range far from the pines. When I moved into his mother's house the months before our wedding, Nathaniel's whole aspect changed. In Burlington, he had been austere and upright in the saddle. In the White Cedar swamps, he dismounted and walked his magnificent bay along the streams that fed into the Batstow River. I grew to discover the land Nathaniel called his home was varied, with his bog ore works and farm in the cleared land of the uplands, distantly ringed by pitch pines and clustered next to his mother's farmhouse, and the sawmill belonging to their nearest neighbours, the Ditchleys. Beyond, there were the wet meadows where the herders kept their sheep. Further still, there was sugar sand of the pine plains where the soil was poor, the ground covered with heather. Nathaniel's mother ran her own farm with help from his younger brothers and their wives. It had been agreed that I would live at her farmhouse until the wedding, although her farm was known as Cranberry Farm for the profusion of the tart red berries that grew in bogs nearby. Mrs. Shy's orchards were the envy of the county. Arriving as I had in autumn, I joined in the masses of kinfolk and neighbours who picked apples, which were sold to the distilleries and made into cider, whisky and brandy. I knew the taste of apple whisky well, as my own parents had sold it from their tavern. As Mrs. Shy was on good terms with the distilleries north of the Pine Barrens, and because of Nathaniel's activity in Monmouth County, the family had become well known. In Bucks Cove Run, nothing occurred to make me regret my decision to marry Nathaniel Shy and to uproot myself from Burlington for an isolated rural existence, ever connected and beholden to the Pine Barrens themselves. Nathaniel made several excursions across the Pinelands, though his visits to Monmouth County and the Committee of Correspondence lessened as fall turned into winter. We had planned our wedding for the days before Christmas, to be held at Nathaniel's house, an argument long fought with the pastor of the church. "Well, I still must strongly protest." This was Reverend Lee, who had stopped for supper at Cranberry Farm and, due to the premature snow that was whipping through the pines, was going to spend the night. He appealed to Mrs. Shy. "In the light of these troubled times, Mrs. Shy, do you not think it would be a show of unity to be married in the church?" "I do not think he has been married before." "I have not been married before," interjected Nathaniel. "But Reverend Lee, Mrs. Lovell has, and I reckon it's likely she was married in a church." The supper table chuckled at this teasing of the pastor. I knew Nathaniel well enough to understand it as a remedy to the tensions of these troubled times. Reverend Lee was able to return to the church in the morning, where, I heard the story later, he was confounded by the disappearance of his sexton. He knew her to be an upright, sober woman, unlike, rumour had it, her son. She too was a widow and supported her grown-up son. The following Sunday, when the premature snow flurries had given way to crisp, sunny days, I saw Anne Lawrence, the sexton, after she'd rung the bells. a stout woman, big-armed with muscle, dressed drably and practically. She smiled often, despite her rather serious work. She was not smiling on Sunday. Her face had been bludgeoned, leaving purple, yellowish bruises. Her arms, bare to the elbow, were the same. She would not speak to me or Mrs. Shy about what had happened. "Ask your son," she had said acidly to Mrs. Shy. I had felt cold as she had said this. Mrs. Shy and I returned to Cranberry Farm, where I sat long hours by the window, waiting for Nathaniel to return. I was tired, having woken up at 4 in the morning the previous Friday to help Mrs. Shy with ironing. When at last Nathaniel appeared, I asked him what had happened to Mrs. Lawrence. "Who was it beat her?" I demanded. "She's a strong woman. She digs the graves." "It was her son," said Nathaniel. "She would not give him any more money for drink." It would have been difficult to believe, but Tom Lawrence had inherited his mother's brute strength and his father's height, for it was well known that his father had been the tallest man in Bucks Cove Run in living memory, well over 6 feet. "Does Reverend Lee know this? Tom Lawrence must not get away with this." Nathaniel laid his hand on mine. "He's dead." "Dead?" I repeated. "A man may beat his wife to death in London," Nathaniel said with sudden vehemence, "but no male relation will correct his kinswoman in such a brutal manner. Not here." I blinked. "Am I to take this as admission of guilt?" "I committed no murder," Nathaniel said, his face twisting into a sneer. "We persuaded Tom Lawrence to leave the county. It was the night of the snowstorm. He was addled with drink. It was an unfortunate accident, but he cannot lay a hand upon his mother again. My first husband had died of an accident. He'd fallen down a flight of stairs. It had been purely a freak of chance, whereas this spoke more of malice." I wondered who had accompanied Nathaniel on his mission of persuasion. Were they too meeting in committees of correspondence in protest of British tyranny? "You do know, Dicey," he said, in a softer tone, though he frowned, "that the Pine Barrens can be a refuge for robbers and thieves." "It does not surprise me," he said. See, I had seen Nathaniel since my arrival, talking with men about the advantages of the powder horn and the rifle over the musket and the squirrel gun. He had shown me the powder horn he had inherited from his father, the membrane shaved so thin you could see the level of powder inside and ornately carved. Anyone with eyes in their heads knew that the ironworks in Batstow was going to become more important than ever. There were rumours that Boston was already putting in secret orders for cannonballs. I had grown used to the ways of the people in the Pinelands, some of whom came from New York or Pennsylvania or from the clustered towns of northern New Jersey, some who came from the woods of Ohio, like my betrothed. My father fought in Pontiac's War. In our many hours of courting, Nathaniel had never mentioned this before. After Shawnees and Delawares attacked settlers in Ohio, in Burlington, I had only ever seen Moravian Munseys, Christian Indians who had been embracing the pacifism of that religion. I had read of white captives who had seen torture and savagery decades before I was born. I tried to read Nathaniel's meaning in his posture. in the grim lines of his face, of the scar on his cheek of which he never spoke. "Are you saying you wish to fight, given a good reason?" "Your sister-in-law in Philadelphia." He changed the subject abruptly, getting up to stand in front of the fire, his hands clasped thoughtfully behind him. "Frances Bell. Is she to persist in running her shop with imported British goods? People are beginning to talk." "And what are they saying?" "How can the wife of Nathaniel Shy align herself with someone who not only refuses the boycott, but actually sells Britain's goods? Things like tea and British fabrics. Can you not see? I'm aiming to make us independent here, where we have everything we need. The timber, the ore, sand and shells to make glass, orchards, farmland, beholden to none." I was stung by these questions. Had public opinion clamoured to such a pitch that I was being condemned as an accessory to tyranny merely for having a sister-in-law who sold British goods in her shop? I'd always been proud, approving of Nathaniel's views as they had chimed with my own and my neighbours', his kin in Burlington. I thought of the precipitate judgment passed on Tom Lawrence. Had Nathaniel's genesis on the frontier engendered a savage bloodlust? Do you suggest that such impulsive justice as was meted out to Tom Lawrence should attend on Francis? Nathaniel wished me good night and swept out of the room. This was not the kind of scene that one wished to undergo 3 days before one's wedding. We saw little of each other the next day, the day before the wedding. Nathaniel returned to his mother's house and caught me gazing out the window towards the pines. "I think the way forward is with ironworks, Dicey," he said slowly, deliberately meeting my gaze. "And with ironworks, more people will settle here, and they will have children who will need schooling." I gasped, because I'd just been thinking that we might someday clear the land beyond the pines and build a school. This I took as a sign of reconciliation. And so, December 22nd, the night of the wedding, arrived. I was dressed in my finest gown of silver-coloured silk and wrapped warmly in a fur-lined cloak, my feet protected from driving sleet by pattens. I was accompanied by Mrs. Shy, her sons and daughters-in-law, and by my neighbours from Burlington Street. The rest of the guests had already gathered at my Nathaniel's farm. At the entrance to the sitting room, as Mrs. Shy helped me to arrange my gown, Reverend Lee caught me. "I hope you will at least agree that your child's christening should take place in the church." His tone was indulgent, but mildly reproving. I looked wildly about me to see who'd told him, as I had not begun to show. I had little time to contemplate this further, as we were already late, the ceremony past time to begin. We entered the room without further incident, and the service was carried out. Nathaniel's hands and mine had just been linked for the ring to be placed on my finger. I became aware of the sounds of shouting from outside. Reverend Lee paused in his pronouncements. One of the Cox family standing nearest the front door slipped out cautiously as Nathaniel urged Reverend Lee to continue. We heard more shouting, urgent by degrees, then triumphant. "They're burning the sawmill!" Mr. Cox ran in. The room was full of motion. Guests flung on mantles and coats to follow Mr. Cox outside. I stood still, in the confusion. Nathaniel left me with the ring in my hand. I ran to the window. There were bright flames illuminating the early darkness that winter brings, coming from the direction of the sawmill. I could hear them singing faintly, which seemed not to be coming from the sawmill, but from the pines themselves. A stands for Americans who scorn to be slaves. B for Boston, where fortitude their freedom saves. When cooler heads prevailed, Reverend Lee himself reported that the mill itself had not caught fire. Some self-styled Sons of Liberty young fools broke into the cellar and set the tea chests ablaze. Still the song echoed in my head. F stands for fate, dreadful to both people and king. G stands for George, may God give him wisdom and grace. H stands for the hypocrite who wears a double face. The wedding service was conducted in its entirety on 12th night, with only close family in attendance. The antics of the night of December 22nd were condemned by some as foolishness. More evidence that people who talk themselves into believing themselves oppressed are capable of anything. But I judged, and rightly. I see in retrospect that this was the beginning, not simply of a war in which militia fought against King George's army, but in civil war. Sarah Golding was reading Alphabet by Leslie McMurtry. Original music was by Catherine Seaton. It was mixed by Leslie McMurtry and Catherine Seaton. It was a Lesser of Two Weevils production for the Drift and Ramble podcast.
Thanks again to Leslie McMurtry for her story Alphabet. She wrote and produced this particular episode. She also worked with Catherine Seaton, who is the composer who provided such wonderful music and co-produced the episode. And then Sarah Golding did the narration for all of that. Sarah is someone you've heard many times on this podcast, and she is immensely talented, and we're so glad to have everyone who was a part of that production be a part of this production. Thank you all so much. So happy Thanksgiving to all of you. We're really happy to have another episode for you. We know they're coming slow, and they are probably not going to be too many more of these. But I did want to say thanks once again to all of you. We're very grateful to have you as a listener. We're grateful to have the many friends that we've made through this podcast. And Cheryl, what are some of the things that you're thankful for this year?
I'm thankful for having some actual wintry-like weather in Southern California.
You seem to be thankful for that adult beverage that you're holding in your hand.
Well, yeah.
I'm holding one too. And yes, I agree. It finally rained, which is something we don't actually get in Southern California. There's a song about that, I think.
Yeah. You're not going to sing it, are you?
No.
Okay.
No, we don't. People might have just heard this after having Thanksgiving meals. We don't want to upset anyone's tummy. We're hoping that you did have a nice Thanksgiving and that you have a lot to be thankful for. And I'll just make a brief statement about being thankful and showing gratitude. This has changed my life, and I hope that you will take a moment to make gratitude a priority in your life. When you show gratitude, it changes your attitude. It sounds silly, but it really does, and it will make a huge difference for you. So please try to somehow weave that into the tapestry of your daily routine. That's my speech for today. I don't know what caused me to say that, but I will say this. Cheers to you, and I hope that you're coming into a very happy holiday season with you, yours, your family, all of your loved ones, and we just hope the best for you.
Cheers, everyone, and happy Thanksgiving and happy holidays.
From the Drift and Ramble podcast,